Okay, the meetings are recorded.
Go ahead, Mr. Chair. Hope you're muted.
I'd like to welcome everybody to November 21st City of Salem Finance Committee meeting. I'm the chair, Jose Gonzalez. And with this, I'll give everybody, all the other members, a chance to introduce themselves.
Councilor Stapleton, Ward 1.
Got a stall. Are we introducing everybody? All right. Linda Nishioka, Ward 2.
Councilor Mickey Varney, Ward 8. Member.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, all the staff present, thank you for your time. Let's see. So approve the minutes. They look good. I'd be looking for a motion to accept.
I move that we accept the minutes.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Member Varney and then member Nishioka, second. Any comments, questions, or concerns? All look good. Oh, yes. Member
You know what?
Nishioka?
I think I'm still alternate. Can I make a second? So I'll back off and have somebody else second it. I think I'm still an alternate. I don't know.
You can participate. Councilor Nordyke isn't available today.
Okay,
That's right.
great. Thank you.
That's right. So we're good to go. Nishioka second. Everybody in favor? Any opposed? Okay. Okay, minutes are approved. Do we have anybody signed up for public comment?
Not this evening.
Okay. So move on to number 4. Any action items? I didn't see any on the agenda. Anything else, Josh, on that item?
No, not today.
Awesome. Okay. Moving right along to number 5, management update. Is that you, Josh?
It is. Yeah, I'll start off and then I'll hand it out to our guest from Moss Adams.
Okay.
Just real quick, 5A, if you had a chance to take a look at it, was a staff report that was delivered to the Budget Committee back in May. It just outlined a deferred staffing needs analysis that staff put together. And just kind of in our continuum of work, the next piece that came after that, Moss Adams is going to be presenting an internal service benchmarking, which really helps validate, our assumptions of staffing needs. We have third party take a look at police staffing, fire staffing. So this is our attempt to look at our internal service needs also. So with that, I'll turn it over to Colleen and Tommy with Moss Adams.
Great, thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. Colleen Rosillas with Moss Adams. I'm joined by Tommy Conkling. We're very happy to be here this evening to share with you the results of the phase 1 of this work. Tommy, do you want to share your screen?
Already go whenever you're calling.
Awesome. Okay. If you could go to the next slide. So a little bit about the work that we have done for the city. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I went to Orange County. I saw people in person. I got sick. That's what happens when you see people in 3 dimensions. So we were tasked with a few things with the city. The first was to look at the results of the deferred needs analysis that city staff did and essentially validate that, take a look compared to peers and see how cities that are also full service, that are like sized and have kind of a similar population, provide services to their residents, what their level of service may be, and what their internal service staffing looks like. We worked with a group of city staff overseeing all of these functions in the city manager's office to really dig into that benchmarking analysis and make sure that it was correct. And then we're going to talk about what happens next after this with you all. Next slide, please. So in 2022, the Budget Committee asked the city to provide basically what would you need in terms of staffing to actually meet the service level that the community has asked us for. And that deferred needs analysis, as Josh said, was presented to you earlier this year. The city wanted that confirmation from us, really from that independent third party perspective of what do other cities look like and what's happening kind of in the marketplace. given the passage of the bond and given the city strategic plan, which was really developed understanding that there are quite a few very large cross-functional initiatives in progress, there's an anticipation that we're probably going to need some additional ongoing revenue, sustainable revenue to meet those current service levels. And so we're looking for ideas of how other cities are organized, what services they provide, and taking a look at potential revenue scenarios. And then we also have worked with the city to take a look at the forecast, making sure that how that work is done is in accordance with best practices, so that when we come to the council and the public, that if there is an asset, that is accurate. So as I mentioned, our goal is to really provide that independent third-party analysis of your forecast, your expenditure scenarios, and what potential revenues could be. So in that box, that's really kind of, you are here, right? So we're looking at that internal service staffing level analysis, we're benchmarking it, and then we're presenting it to you. So we're checking off that box tonight. And our timeline, we started this work in July. We will be working alongside the city as they do their forecasting over the next several months. And then starting next month, we'll really be digging into that revenue scenario analysis with the goal of presenting that to you early next year so that you can take a look at that in alignment with next year's budget. And I'm going to hand it over to Tommy to talk about our results.
So I'm going to be going over the process now that we use for benchmarking internal services at Salem, and then the results that we obtained. So the first task in benchmarking analyses is the identification of appropriate peers. And before we could do so, we had to set our priorities and parameters. So for this analysis, we wanted to make sure that we compared Salem to other full service cities that provide as close as possible the same services and functions performed by Salem. Now, every city is going to be unique. No two cities are going to match exactly. However, we wanted the functions that Salem performs to closely match the functions performed by the peers chosen. We also prioritized similarly sized cities, and we restricted our analysis to the Western continental United States. Our peer identification process starts from a large list of initial cities, and then it systematically narrows this down to a usable small group. First, we started with all 5,700 cities in the states pictured. We then filtered this list by population, selecting only cities within approximately 25% of Salem's population, which got us a list of 40. Using these 40 potential peer cities, we narrowed down this list further through department analysis and a community analysis. First, for a department analysis, we analyzed the organizational structure of each city to determine if each of Salem's departments has a corresponding department in that city. Now, although we're interested in functions performed rather than how a government is organized, this department analysis allowed us to efficiently narrow down the list of peer cities. So for example, if a city did not have a parks or library department, we could often easily identify if these functions were instead performed by a county or a special district, helping us really narrow that list down. We also compared each city's community characteristics to Salem. Although our priority was on identifying peers by the functions they performed, we also weighed community characteristics in our decisions. For example, if a city perfectly matched each of Salem's functions, but the median income and educational attainment were 2 or 3 times higher or lower, it might not be the best comparator for Salem. In this community characteristics, we examined population, household income, percent of the population under the federal poverty line, educational and demographic characteristics, and total land area. And these analyses allowed us to identify the 16 cities in these regions that most closely match Salem. We then took these 16 finalists and then we performed in-depth analyses for each of the services and functions they performed. We determined if each city performs every function performed by Salem. We also determined if each city provides significantly more services than Salem because we wanted the functions performed by peer cities to match Salem's as close as possible. This analysis yielded a ranking for each of the 16 cities, allowing us to quantify how similar that city is to Salem. We then brought this list to our partners at the city, and in consultation with the city team, 8 final peer cities were chosen. Corona, Eugene, Glendale, California, Modesto, Oceanside, Salt Lake City, Spokane, and Tempe. After full service peer cities were identified, we performed the actual internal services benchmarking. And for this, we primarily looked at the following 3 benchmarks. First, we looked at staffing levels for each internal service. We then examined operational expenses for each internal service function. And then finally, we examined the capacity of these functions, which is a measure that we developed that combined both the staffing of internal services, with how much these services outsource. So first, here are the summarized results from the staffing benchmarking analysis. For each of these internal service functions, we examined how much the staffing of these peer cities varied from Salem's staffing. The difference between peer cities' average staffing levels and Salem staffing levels is presented. Higher numbers, highlighted in red, indicate areas where peers had staffing levels, on average, greater than Salem's. Negative numbers, highlighted in green, indicate areas where peers have lower staffing levels than Salem. All but 4 of Salem's internal service functions show relative understaffing compared to peers. And this understaffing is greatest at the city manager's office, purchasing, finance, fleet, legal, and human resources. I will highlight, however, that the results of this benchmarking metric for information technology are a bit deceiving. As I'll discuss a little bit later on, Salem has invested more in its in-house application development for IT rather than outsourcing more. So while IT does indeed have more staff compared to peer cities, it actually has fewer resources devoted to it than other cities, which the other 2 benchmarks that we're going to talk about will show. Next, we examine the operational expenses for internal service functions. You'll immediately notice here that there are fewer functions listed. For internal service expenses, there was much less detailed information available than staffing. Although many cities publish employee level information on how internal service functions are staffed, the financial information that was publicly available and that cities shared with us was organized by department. So unlike in the staffing analysis, where we were able to break down some of these internal services into more specific functions, we had to analyze functions here more generally. So despite the limitations on how granular this operational expense analysis could be, it showed some important results. Internal services in Salem are funded 87% lower compared to peers on average. In dollar terms, this difference is between $650,000 and $5 or $6 million, depending on function. One important thing to note with this analysis, however, is the results for the finance department. This expense analysis cannot account for how centralized or decentralized peer cities' finance functions are. If peer cities' finance functions are more centralized in Salem, this figure may be a modest overestimate of the difference in funding. However, the gap between Salem's finance function funding and peer cities is so large that even if this is a modest overestimate, it still signifies that Salem's finance department is under-resourced compared to peers. And then finally, we examined capacity. Capacity is a measure that combines internal employees with the money that cities spend on outsourcing services. It gives us a rough estimate of how much capacity or manpower each city's internal service functions have available. We calculate this figure for each function in each city, including Salem, by finding the per employee spend on operational expenses. We then use this with outsourcing expenses to get an estimate of approximately how many employees outsourcing effectively replaces. By combining existing employees with the employees that outsourcing replaces, we get an estimate of capacity or manpower available for each internal service. Like operational expenses, this benchmark shows understaffing in every function where data was available. On average, internal services in Salem have 78% less capacity than in peer cities, especially in the city manager's office and in the legal function. Importantly, as I previously mentioned, This analysis shows that because IT invests in in-house application development, when we measure capacity rather than staffing, Salem's IT is under-resourced compared to peers. Finally, we have to take all these benchmarks and look at them holistically. On the right of this grid, you'll see a summary of each of the benchmark analyses that I just reviewed. On the left, you'll see our answer to the question, overall, is this function under-resourced in Salem? In nearly every case, Salem has less staffing, less capacity, and fewer dollars devoted to operations. In conclusion, compared to full-service cities, almost all internal service functions in Salem are understaffed and under-resourced. Our analysis independently reaffirms the findings of internal services understaffing that the city has examined previously in its deferred needs analysis. And with that, I will pass it back over to Colleen, who's going to talk about the implications of all this work.
All right, thanks, Tommy. So you saw a lot of charts with red, green, yellow. It was mostly red. And what does that mean? The number one takeaway is that ability to support that desired or required resident level of service. Your community survey results are bearing that out a little bit. And there's also the important piece of, since we just passed a large bond that doesn't have operational funding, we have the need to be able to actually support being able to deliver to the community. And we've absolutely worked with other communities where they've had similar passages or bonds and levies, and then the need to be able to staff up in these key functions like procurement, like human resources, to be able to actually do the purchasing and delivery of capital products can absolutely slow that down and erode community trust. So it's really important that we actually have the people to deliver on our promises. Another piece that's really important that we've noted is in a number of pieces of our work for the city is that there are some very critical policy and service areas that have a single responsible party. That includes homelessness, for example. Strategic initiatives as a whole across the city, because of that limited capacity in the city manager's office, are not being delivered with that same capacity as peers. And that puts you at risk of not being able to identify those new issues, potential initiatives, and really take that ball and run with it when council has a priority or there's a significant emerging need. The city also lacks pretty significant analytical capacity, particularly in those general funded departments. So the ability to do data-driven decision-making is limited. And that can be challenging, especially given how much data and information is thrown at us, and especially in supporting what the council needs to make decisions and have everything that you have to be able to dig through these complex issues. Within human resources, that recruiting piece is a challenge, as well as just being able to retain high performers, because we are limited in our ability to pay folks compared to our peers, and we have fewer staffing and folks are working harder. We've got a lot of people who are highly devoted to the city and wearing a lot of hats and really high performers, but that also puts them at risk for leaving for other places where their jobs might not be as complicated or challenging. And then there's that additional capacity that we have for implementing those best practices like training and development, improving internal communications and data governance. Because of the strain on internal services, that's definitely decreasing. And I would say overall that, because we have so many people wearing multiple hats and because we have so much work on folks' plates, that clarity of roles and responsibilities, who's doing what and who's responsible for what, that can really get strained when we are this understaffed. So let's talk a little bit about your risks. I think that from an organizational perspective, there are a number of risks to think about. And when we think about folks in your role, really having to keep in mind, we want to reduce risk, we want to improve our performance. HR and legal compliance is definitely at the top, especially given how understaffed the legal department is. That can be a concern. There are risks in terms of union relations and employee relations. IT security, thankfully cybersecurity and the ERP was built into the bond, but it's absolutely a significant risk for all cities. There's so much data, so much personal information that all cities hold. And so it's very important, particularly as you operate utilities, to keep IT security at the top of that list. Ethics and procurement. So you have a highly decentralized procurement operation that really relies on folks in departments to know what they're doing. And so when we have that decentralization, holding folks accountable to policies and procedures can be more difficult and things can slip through the cracks. Those are the things that put you on the front page, and that's absolutely not what you want. And we want to keep you out of that as well. And then finally, there's just succession planning, right? Holding on to that institutional knowledge when folks do leave, making sure we have backups for key positions, and really holding that knowledge core so that we can continue to serve the community with a high level. So with that, we'll go into questions. I just wanted to give you an update on where we are right now and then where we'll go next. So back to that timeline slide, we have done our internal service benchmarking. We're working with the city to review and validate the financial forecast. We'll look at existing revenue scenarios. There's been quite a few that came up pre-pandemic, so we'll work with the city to help refresh those and validate those, and then take a look at other cities and see what other potential scenarios there might be for additional sustainable general fund revenue. And with that, I think we'll stop sharing and we'll let you ask questions.
Thank you, Colleen. Any questions for Colleen? Yes, Member Steve.
Thanks. Well, I think, I'm not sure I have formulated a question yet. That was a ton of information to take in. It confirmed, I think it confirms for all of us exactly what we thought was going on, right? And where the needs were and where we could, the risks. I think that was a really great thing to point out, especially for us at council to fully understand those is really important for us. So I wanted to thank you first and foremost for pulling all this information together. And I really look forward to hearing back from you again on what what you find would be still good choices to move forward as far as revenue. And then also to see what other cities are doing. That is really intriguing to me. I think everything has changed since the pandemic. And so taking a fresh look at that, I'm really excited to see that information and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Member Steve. Any other questions? Well, I have a few. As far as the, looking at the staffing and the differences between the cities, obviously it started somewhere, so I'm curious is where did that, have we always been lower staffed compared to other cities? Is that something that started, because as I was looking at some of those cities, obviously we're all different, but I'm wondering, what are their satisfaction levels when they, when they survey their residents? Is it that, so I know was it, I looked up some of the information and I think it was a certain percentage were either unhappy with the direction, but then also said nationally it was about the same. So I wonder if those other cities do they have high satisfaction levels? Because I'm also thinking about the end result. What does all this mean to the resident here? Or what are they achieving that we aren't? And of course, just like Member Stapleton said, are they raising more revenue and how are they doing that? Yeah.
Josh, do you want to take the first part of that question on the history of staffing?
Yeah, great question. It really is rooted, a couple meetings ago, we talked about the property tax history and kind of our limitations there. So back in the 90s, if you look at that staff report.
Is that every city though? Is that every city?
In Oregon, you'll see a common trend for sure with that, couple decade look and decreased capacity just in general. It varies based on the city and their kind of frozen permanent tax rate, and if they've been able to come up with other revenue sources. Our permanent tax rate's in the $5, Eugene's over $7. So there's just some fundamental differences in tax rate and tax base. But there are. For us, it really started with property taxes being limited back in the 90s, and then further exacerbated really during the recession, where we made some pretty significant reductions in staffing.
And I would absolutely echo that. So what we see in internal service staffing since the last recession is that it's easier to add external service positions, that folks are really nervous about adding internal service positions, but it's easier to make the case maybe to council and the public that we're adding those direct service roles. So we saw a big decrease in internal service staffing, 2008 to 2011. And then other cities we have seen maybe a slower ramp up. In Oregon in general, that is compressed. Even Eugene, which we compare you to, which is in a more favorable tax and revenue position, they absolutely will also say the same thing about their internal services. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of cities on this list, and no city is perfect, right? But the one that you're closest to, Corona, California, they operated on a less with less mindset for a long time, and just recently have kind of a fresh administration and a city council that is more interested in leveling up their level of service and hiring more internal service staff. What we see in general is that these cities are able to do a little bit more, right? It's going to be targeted, but all government absolutely is limited in terms of their revenues and what they can do and pick and choose. But they definitely are able to do a little bit more than Salem can.
So, any chance do they have any, maybe we can look it up, any of their customer satisfaction surveys?
Yeah, you're pretty
Yeah.
rare in doing a statistically significant satisfaction survey, but we can definitely take a look at these cities and see if there is something comparable or interested that we could provide.
Yeah, one thing.
Because only because you, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I was just going to add, one thing that might be challenging with that is, a lot of this work is based on the internal services, and a lot of the community surveys are going to be on external services. So there might be a correlation, but you're not going to see the direct impact. It really focuses on those risks. You're insulating the community from seeing the impacts of those reductions, but you're increasing the potential risk kind of on the back end with those internal services.
Yeah, and I'm from Detroit, so I love a car metaphor. So I really see internal services as that engine that really provides the power to the rest of the city, right? And you have to take care of your engine. If you don't do maintenance, if you don't add gas, that's not part of the engine. I'm losing my metaphor. But if you don't take care of your engine, you can't deliver the rest of your services, right? The car's not going to drive. And so it's really important that we do take care of those internal services. I've seen in other cities, for example, if they have a public safety staffing measure, they actually include an internal service staffing ratio. So say we're going to hire, for every 8 to 10 officers, we're going to hire a person in HR, we're going to hire half a person in finance to be able to support that additional level of work. Those are some things that we've seen built in to really acknowledge that, because it's absolutely an additional burden of work every time we take on those new services.
No, totally. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think I only mentioned the satisfaction survey because I think that was it. You maybe mentioned that was reflective. Some of our things were reflective, and that's why we had that lower score. So that's why I mentioned it. And I think on the risk, what might be helpful, I think, for this group is to have levels of risk. Are we at low, mid, high risk on some of these issues? Because as we start thinking about some of these things, we can't do it all. So what are we going to prioritize? I know the city of Kaiser got held hostage for $16K, I think it was a couple of years ago. What didn't they get? They got locked out of their system, correct? Right, Josh, I don't know if you want to update everybody on that, because I forgot the details.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, they got, I think it was ransomware, where they basically had to pay a certain amount to get access to their data.
Member Nishioka.
Thank you, Chair. I love your analogy to the car, Colleen, but when you were speaking of the idea of building in the additional support for staffing with some bond issues, it seems to me that I've heard, and again, I'm new, so I'm still trying to figure out bonds. A lot of times I hear bonds are something that can only be capital and can't be people. So are there other cities that have been able to capture building people into a bond like that, or are we the only ones that can't do it?
If I may, so you're right, a bond is restricted to capital infrastructure. We can cover some personnel costs, if it's part of the project, but in general, you're not going to add staffing based on a capital project. I think what Colleen was referencing is really revenue measures for operations. So if you're adding a utility fee or a property tax levy, something like that, building in some ratio for adding internal staffing.
Yeah, exactly. So thinking about a tax, thinking about other kind of fees, other opportunities for revenue under a bond, what we might see is that maybe a portion of the overhead costs could be allocated out to departments for help, but you're not necessarily going to see, an individual hired tied to a bond that is not related to directly delivering that work, because that's not typically how they're structured and not the promise we made to the community as well.
Well, I think it's become clear certainly to me, and probably all the other counselors, that we really need to figure out some ways to improve revenue. And that's what I'm looking forward to hearing, what these options, might be that could come to us. So it sounds like that's something that that Colleen, you're going to be bringing forward some concepts. Am I understanding correctly?
So what we'll be doing is the city will bring them forward. We're going to work with them in collaboration, and then we'll be able to provide that kind of additional capacity and resource, as well as be able to validate those as, kind of the most potentially effective for you all and what that might look like.
All right, thank you.
So thank you, Member Nishioka. Any other questions or comments? Sounds like we're good. Thank you, Colleen, for the information. Very helpful. Yeah, we'll definitely be looking forward to the next steps in this process. See,
Us too.
yeah. Okay, Josh, any continued business? Number 6.
Not necessarily continued business, but I would like to ask the committee if we'd like to forego the meeting in December and just plan to meet in January, given the compressed couple weeks you guys have there at the beginning.
Looks like I'm getting a smile, thumbs up, thumbs up. Yeah, I think, Josh,
Fine.
early gift to you or us, I guess, Sure.
Great.
Looks like we have a consensus on that, an agreement. Anything else in the continuing business, or even let's just jump to new business? Josh, anything new there?
A couple things you'll see in January. You'll see our quarterly investment report that incorporates the ESG reporting. And then you also see the audit. So our general ledger staff are working hard to get that complete. So the due date's December 31st. So we'll have that ready for you, and we'll have the auditors there at your January meeting for that presentation also.
That's good, Josh. Can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm looking forward to the audit. So, Member Nishioka.
What does ESG stand for, please?
Environmental, social, and governance. So it's the new investment policy that was adopted by council this last year. So it just layers onto our investments that additional risk rating.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Great question, Member Nishioka. Okay, Josh, I think, let's see, anything else for the good of the order? All right, well, with that, the meeting's adjourned. See you shortly. See most of you shortly. Take care.